Athar's Garage. In this video, I'm going to be upgrading my steering bell cranks on my two-wheel drive Slash to aluminum bell cranks. The stock bell cranks are made out of very flexible plastic, and you end up losing a lot of steering feel in the car. So I'll be upgrading to aluminum. I've had great success with using some off-brand aluminum bell cranks. You can go ahead and buy like the Hot Racing stuff or the STRC stuff, but I'm going to be using this glow packed RC upgrade that I found on Amazon. Had good reviews, and like I said, I've used these, you know, unbranded or really not a name brand RC products, and I've had great results. So let's get started. So the kit comes with a bunch of hardware, and if you have the low center of gravity Slash, you won't be needing these longer screws. These longer screws are used on the high CG chassis. So I'm gonna go ahead and set these aside. It comes with a bunch of bearings. This is 4 bearings, 3 screws. I'll probably be needing 3 nylock nuts and a bunch of washers, some that are large and some that are small. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take apart what's already assembled and add some Loctite to these screws. Anything that goes into aluminum or metal, definitely want to add some Loctite on those screws because you do not want those to back out. I mean, and those are barely tight, so definitely check your screws. No matter what brand you buy, I would definitely check and add some Loctite. And you don't want to over tighten these so they bind, but the bushings that they include are actually very nice, have a good feel to it, and there's really no play in it. Nice and free, that's exactly what you want. So the bearings that came with the kit are metal shielded, so there's nothing you can do. You can't take it apart and clean out the bearings and re-grease them. So just go ahead and install them. And we can set that aside for now. Next, you're going to need your chassis, and we're going to take apart the front end so we can access the bell cranks. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is actually open up the ESC box and unplug the steering servo. So the steering servo should be in channel 1, and you can feed that wire out a little bit. You don't have to take it out all the way, but this will give you enough place so you're not straining the wire when you disconnect the front end. If you have the stock bumper, you should have 2 screws that hold it on top, here and here. That way, when you take that off, you're gonna have to take the front bumper off in order to access these 2 screws. But if you have the RPM bumper like me, we're gonna take the 5 screws that hold on the front off, and those 5 screws are located here, the center here, and right there. All right, So with those 5 screws off, you can twist the front end, take it out just like that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the steering linkage off the bell crank. There's that 1 screw right there. Next, what we're going to do is remove the 2 screws that hold the bell cranks onto the plastic here and here. And that is a 2.5mm Allen. Before you take the screws out, take note as to how the washers are installed. On the high CG chassis, the washers are installed slightly differently. If I'm not mistaken, there's 2 washers at the bottom. On the low CG chassis, you have a large washer and a small washer on the top. And as you can see, my steering bell crank that does not have any bearings in it. So that gives a lot of play in my steering. All right, so next what we're gonna do is we are going to uninstall the nut and screw that are holding on the steering links onto the bell crank. And you can use your wheel nut wrench to hold onto that nut. I'm going to take off the wire for the steering servo from the chassis so I have a little bit more room to work with, and it makes it easier for y'all to see. So what we'll do now is we'll take apart the steering links from the bell crank, and you just hold back up on that nut and you can take it. So as you can see, the stock plastic bell cranks, they have a lot of give and play, and one of my sides is actually kind of hollowed out. See if y'all can see that. So that hole there isn't quite round, and that was giving me a lot of play in my steering. So now what we can do is we can install the new bell crank. And before we do that, I'm going to test fit the screws. Alright, so the screws they gave in the kit aren't quite long enough to hold the nut through the ball end. So we will not be using the screws that they provided. They provided 2 short screws and 1 long screw. That long screw is probably what we need, but unfortunately they didn't include 2 of those. So we're going to reuse the screws from our old bell crank because they are longer. So I'm going to remove the washers that were on the bottom. I believe these are like plastic type washers. Plastic rubberized, so we're not going to use those. We're going to use the provided washers in the kit that are metal. So on the low CG chassis, you only need 1 washer on the bottom. And then the bearings keep popping out, so I'm just going to go ahead and install the bearings onto the the plastic shaft. So next we can take our long screws from our old bell cranks and thread them through. We're not going to put Loctite on these just because they're going to have a lock nut on the other end. So not too worried about those backing out. You can snug those up. So make sure that you're installing the bell cranks in this orientation with the arm that goes to the servo is going to be on this side. And you can go ahead and install your lock nut. You just hold back up on your screw and you can tighten that lock nut. Once it's tight, make sure everything can still move freely and there's no binding. So we're good there. I can move on to the other side. Now we can install the steering bell cranks onto the plastic pieces on the lower piece. And there you go. Just make sure that your bearings are installed properly. And you can see that there's actually no play in there, so that's perfect. So we're going to use a large washer on both sides and then a smaller washer on top and the screw. And again, those screws are 2.5 millimeters, so we can go ahead and tighten this down. All right. Once it's tightened, you want to make sure that you didn't over tighten it and there's no binding. So as you can see, I over tighten mine. It barely moves, so I'm going to back off just a tad on both until the steering starts to move freely. A little better. There you go, that moves nice and free. There's no binding, so that'll definitely help the servo to not be overworked. Next, what we can do is I'm going to use the long screw they provided and I will actually put the third nut that they included in the kit on the bottom so that it doesn't back out. And if you're not going to use that nut, I definitely recommend putting a little bit of Loctite. But since I'll be using that lock nut, I'm not too worried about it backing off. All right. And we're almost done. Now we can install the front end to your chassis. And first thing I'm going to do is route the servo wire through the slot. Make sure everything is sitting properly on the bottom and that the bell crank screws are sitting in the channels where they're supposed to. So there's these spots in the chassis where the head of the screw sits in, and it supports it on the top, so it reduces the flex. So make sure that they're sitting in there on both sides, which mine are. And now we can reinstall the chassis screws. And then we can go back and tighten it by hand. Remember, you're going into plastic, so you don't need to crank down on it too hard. Once it's shouldered up, you're good. All right, now we can route the servo wire back to the ESC and make sure that you have enough slop in the wire so it doesn't stress it out. And you can install or route your wire on your low CG chassis here and put it on this tab. Then you can plug in your servo. And remember, channel 1 is your steering servo and channel 2 is your ESC. Now we can close up the receiver box. And the first thing we're going to do is install the small cover. Then reinstall the larger cover, ensuring that your gasket is still in place. And then go back and tighten by hand. And you're done. And you'll definitely notice that the steering has tightened up a bit. There's less slop. Additionally, if you get a metal gear servo that is high quality, you can probably get rid of the servo saver here, or tighten up the servo saver, or get an adjustable one, so that way you have better steering. But anyway, well, thanks for joining in on this video. Hope you found this helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe. Please stay tuned for the next videos I got coming up in this series. I'll see you all in the next one. Thanks.